The water turned to ice without warning, a violent shock that stole the breath from my lungs and left me standing naked in the stall, shivering as the spray hit my skin like needles of frozen glass. I reached for the handle, twisting it hard to the right, then to the left, begging the pipes to give me something, anything warmer than this glacial torment, but the shower head only sputtered and groaned before settling into a steady, miserable trickle of cold. I stepped out, wrapping a towel around myself that smelled faintly of damp wool and old dust, my teeth chattering so hard I could feel the vibration in my jaw. I looked at the digital clock on the sink, the red numbers glowing in the dim bathroom light. It was 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, the coldest day of the year so far, and I knew exactly who was responsible. I knew because the phone rang 10 minutes later, waking me from the futile attempt to warm up under the thin blankets of my bed, and when I answered it with a voice thick with sleep and anger, the voice on the other end was smooth, oily, and unmistakably satisfied. Gerald Whitmore told me not to bother calling maintenance because there was no maintenance to call, and that if I wanted hot water, I should have paid the convenience fee on time, even though I had never heard of a convenience fee for hot water in my life, and especially not one that was due 3 days before the rent was even late. He laughed when I protested, a dry, hacking sound that reminded me of leaves skittering over pavement, and told me that the building was undergoing essential system upgrades and that tenants who couldn't handle the temporary inconvenience should consider looking for housing more suited to their delicate sensibilities. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me holding the phone in the freezing silence of my apartment, the silence broken only by the wind howling outside the single-pane windows that rattled in their frames like they were trying to escape the building too. I stood there in the middle of the living room, the phone still in my hand, feeling a heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water I had just been denied. This was not the first time Gerald had tried to squeeze me out, and I knew with a sinking certainty that it would not be the last, but there was something different about this morning, something that shifted the axis of the world just enough for me to see a path forward that Gerald could not possibly anticipate. He thought he was holding all the cards because he held the keys to the building, because he held the lease agreements, because he held the power to lock me out or fine me or harass me until I broke and left. But he did not know what I had done 3 weeks ago when I received the email from my broker confirming the transfer of assets. He did not know that while he was sleeping in his heated home in the suburbs, I had been reviewing financial documents late into the night, tracing the lineage of the debt that held this building together. He did not know that the mortgage note, the actual debt instrument that secured the property itself, had been sold off by the bank to a private equity firm, and that I had managed to intercept that sale, pooling every ounce of savings I had, every bit of inheritance from my grandmother, every penny from the startup exit that I was the one who held the debt over Gerald's head, not the other way around, and as I stood there shivering in my towel, the cold air biting at my exposed legs, I smiled for the first time in months. The building was called Oakwood Heights, though there were no oaks for miles and the only height it possessed was the accumulation of grime on the exterior brickwork that made it look taller than it actually was. It was a 4-story walk-up in a part of the city that was gentrifying slowly, like a bruise healing over time, leaving pockets of decay surrounded by new coffee shops and luxury condos. I had moved in 2 years ago because the rent was controlled, a relic of a previous era that Gerald Whitmore despised with a passion that felt personal. He hated the rent-controlled tenants because we were anchors dragging down his profit margins, constant reminders of money he could be making if he could just clear us out and replace us with young professionals willing to pay double for a closet with a window. I was Unit 304, right above the management office, which meant I heard everything. I heard the arguments when Gerald fired maintenance staff for refusing to cut corners, I heard the phones ringing when tenants called to report leaks that never got fixed, and I heard the heavy tread of his boots pacing the floor below when he was scheming. The building itself was a character in this story, a living, breathing entity that was slowly dying under Gerald's neglect. The hallway carpet was stained with patterns that looked like maps of forgotten continents, sticky in the summer and brittle in the winter. The light bulbs in the stairwell were always out, replaced only when the city inspector was scheduled to visit, flickering on for a day and then burning out again as if they were exhausted by the effort of pretending the building was safe. The radiators clanked and hissed like angry snakes, providing sporadic heat that never quite reached the corners of the rooms, leaving pockets of cold air that settled around your ankles like heavy blankets. Gerald Whitmore was a man who looked like he had been carved out of cheap wax and left in the sun too long. He was in his late 50s, with a complexion that was permanently flushed, as if he was constantly on the verge of a stroke, and hair that was dyed a shade of black that did not exist in nature, slicked back with enough product to waterproof a boat. He wore suits that were slightly too shiny, the fabric catching the light in a way that suggested they were purchased from a discount rack during a liquidation sale, and he always smelled of a cologne that was too sweet, masking the underlying scent of stale tobacco smoke that seemed to cling to him no matter where he went. He had a habit of tapping a gold ring against his teeth when he was thinking, a metallic clicking sound that set my nerves on edge, and he never looked people in the eye when he was lying, which was often. He treated the building not as a home for people, but as a slot machine that was currently malfunctioning, and he was convinced that if he just shook it hard enough, kicked it enough, threatened the people inside enough, it would start paying out again. He viewed every repair request as a personal insult, every late rent payment as an act of war, and every tenant who stood up for themselves as an obstacle to be removed. I had seen him drive people out before. Mrs. Gable on the second floor had lived there for 20 years until Gerald started claiming she was hoarding, sending code enforcement to her door weekly until she had a heart attack and moved in with her daughter. The young couple in 201 had been evicted on a technicality about a guest staying too long, their belongings put on the curb in the rain. I had watched all of this from my window, feeling helpless, feeling small, feeling like there was nothing I could do against a man who owned the ground I stood on. But I had been watching something else too. I had been watching the mail. It started with the fines. A week after the hot water incident, I came home to find a bright orange envelope slipped under my door. It was a notice of lease violation, printed on cheap paper that felt thin and flimsy in my hands. The violation was listed as unauthorized decorative items on windowsill. I walked over to the window and looked at the single succulent plant sitting there, a small green life that I had bought to try to bring some color into the gray monotony of the apartment. Gerald had decided that this plant was a fire hazard, a violation of Clause 14.b of the lease, which stated that no items obstructing emergency egress were permitted. The fine was $50, due immediately, or it would be added to the next month's rent with a late penalty. I laughed when I read it, a bitter, hollow sound in the empty room. It was absurd. The plant was 3 inches wide. It was not obstructing anything. But I knew what this was. This was the opening salvo. This was Gerald testing the waters, seeing how much pressure he could apply before I cracked. I paid the fine. I told myself it was just $50, that it wasn't worth the fight, that I needed to keep my head down and stay secure until I could find a new place. But paying it felt like swallowing a stone, heavy and cold in my stomach. It felt like surrender. The next week, another envelope. This time the violation was excessive noise during quiet hours. I live alone. I work from home. I am quiet by nature. The noise complaint was filed for Tuesday night at 3 in the morning. I was asleep at 3 in the morning. I knew I was asleep because I had been watching a movie until midnight and then passed out. There was no way I was making noise. But Gerald had filed the complaint himself, signing it as a witness to disturbance. The fine was $100. I called the office to dispute it, and the receptionist, a young woman named Sarah who looked perpetually terrified, told me that Gerald was the only one who could authorize reversals and he was in a meeting. I left a message. He never called back. The fine stayed on my ledger. I could see it in the online portal, a red number growing next to my name, a digital scarlet letter marking me as a problem tenant. I started checking the mail every day with a sense of dread, wondering what new infraction I had committed. Had I breathed too loudly in the hallway? Had my shadow crossed the lobby floor at the wrong angle? The harassment was becoming a campaign, a systematic erosion of my sanity designed to make me leave voluntarily so Gerald wouldn't have to go through the trouble of a formal eviction. He wanted me gone, and he was willing to spend as much time as it took to make my life unbearable. The winter freeze hit hard in January, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones and stays there. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero, and the wind chill made it feel like 30 below. The building's heating system, already temperamental, began to fail completely. The radiators went cold, staying cold for days at a time. I wore 3 sweaters indoors. I slept with my coat on. I could see my breath in the living room in the mornings. I walked down to the management office to complain, to demand heat, but the door was locked. There was a sign taped to the glass, management hours temporarily adjusted. Please leave notice. I left a notice. I wrote it in bold letters. Heat is off. Tenants are freezing. This is a health hazard. I slipped it under the door. No response. I called the emergency line. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I started knocking on neighbors' doors. Mrs. Gable was gone, but the new tenant in 204, a nurse named Elena, opened her door wrapped in a blanket. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed. She told me her pipes had frozen and burst, water leaking into the ceiling below, and Gerald had told her it was her fault for keeping the thermostat too low, even though the thermostat was broken and stuck on 50 degrees. She was crying when she told me, tears freezing on her cheeks. She asked me what we were supposed to do. I didn't have an answer for her then. I told her to bundle up, to call the city if she had to, but I knew the city was slow, especially in a building owned by a shell company that Gerald used to hide his assets. He was untouchable, or so he thought. He was counting on the bureaucracy to protect him, counting on the fact that tenants were too tired, too poor, too beaten down to fight back. He was counting on us being victims. I remember standing in my kitchen that night, the darkness pressing against the windows, the cold radiating from the walls. I opened my laptop, the screen glow the only light in the room. I wasn't looking for apartment listings. I wasn't looking for heaters. I was looking at the county recorder's website. I had been doing this for months, ever since I started suspecting that Gerald's ownership was more precarious than he let on. He talked big, he acted like a king, but I had noticed things. The trash collection was sporadic. The landscaping was non-existent. The insurance notices were always past due. These were signs of cash flow problems. A landlord who is squeezing tenants this hard is usually a landlord who is squeezed himself. I typed in the building address. I scrolled through the property records. There was the deed, transferred to Oakwood Holdings LLC, a company registered to Gerald's home address. But below that, there was the mortgage. It was a commercial loan, substantial, taken out 5 years ago when he bought the building. The lender was First Metropolitan Bank. But there was a recent annotation, a flag on the document. The loan was in default. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings 3 months ago. The status was pending sale of note. My heart started beating faster, a rhythmic thumping in my chest that matched the clanking of the cold radiators. This was it. This was the crack in the armor. Gerald wasn't just a slumlord, he was a drowning man. He was harassing us because he was desperate. He needed us out so he could sell the building clean, or he needed the cash flow to keep the bank at bay, but he had failed on both counts. The bank was done with him. They were selling the debt. I spent the next week digging deeper. I called a contact I had from my old job in finance, a guy named David who worked in distressed assets. I didn't tell him why I was asking. I just asked him about the process of buying a mortgage note on a residential commercial property. He told me it was possible, that banks often sold these notes to private investors to get them off the books quickly, especially if the property was troubled. He told me the price would be discounted because of the risk, but it would still require significant capital. I did the math. I looked at my savings. I looked at the stock portfolio I had been holding since the startup exit. It was everything I had. It was my safety net, my future, my retirement. If I bought this note, I would be liquidating my entire financial security into a single, risky asset. If Gerald managed to fix the building, if he managed to pay the bank, I would lose everything. But if I bought the note, I would hold the power. I would be the one he had to answer to. I thought about the cold shower. I thought about Elena crying in her hallway. I thought about the orange fine notices piling up on my counter. I thought about the way Gerald smiled when he told me to deal with the cold. It wasn't just business to him. It was cruelty. He enjoyed it. And I realized that I couldn't just leave. I couldn't just run away and let him do this to the next person who moved into 304. I had to stop him. I had to hit him where it hurt. Not in the courts, not in the papers, but in the wallet. I told David to make the call. I told him to find out who was handling the sale. I told him I was in. The process was a blur of paperwork and wire transfers, conducted in secrecy. I used a proxy LLC to make the purchase, something David set up for me to keep my name off the initial inquiry. I didn't want Gerald to know. I wanted the surprise to be absolute. I wanted to see the look on his face when the ground fell out from under him. While the lawyers worked, the harassment escalated. Gerald must have been feeling the pressure from the bank, because his behavior became erratic, more aggressive. He started showing up at my door unannounced, banging on the wood with his fist, demanding entry for inspections that were not scheduled. I refused to open the door, citing the lease requirement for 24-hour notice. He shouted through the wood, his voice muffled but angry, threatening me with eviction, threatening me with lawsuits, threatening to blacklist me from every rental agency in the city. I recorded everything. I held my phone up to the door, capturing the threats, the banging, the venom in his voice. I saved the files to a cloud drive, labeled them with dates and times. I was building a case, not for the courts, but for myself. I needed to know I was right. I needed to know I was justified. Because what I was planning to do was nuclear. I was planning to take his building. I was planning to become his landlord. The day the transfer finalized, I received an email from the bank's asset management division. It was a simple confirmation. The note had been sold. The ownership of the debt was now held by my LLC. I was the creditor. Gerald Whitmore was now the debtor. He owed me the money. If he didn't pay, I could foreclose. I could take the building. I sat in my chair and read the email 3 times, letting the words sink in. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a quietness that replaced the anger I had been carrying for months. The cold in the apartment didn't bother me as much. The wind outside didn't sound as hostile. I had the power now. But I didn't use it immediately. I didn't call him. I didn't send a notice. I waited. I wanted to let him hang himself. I wanted him to commit fully to his campaign of terror so that when the hammer fell, it would be absolute. I continued to pay my rent, but I stopped paying the fines. I disputed every single one in writing, citing the lease, citing the law, citing the habitability standards. I sent the letters via certified mail. I knew he would ignore them. I knew he would add them to my balance. I wanted the balance to grow. I wanted the debt to look worse on his books. I wanted him to think I was just another tenant he could crush. 2 weeks after I bought the note, Gerald summoned me to his office. It was a Friday afternoon, the light outside fading early in the winter dusk. The notice was hand-delivered, slipped under my door with a specific time slot, 4 p.m. Mandatory meeting regarding lease violations and occupancy status. I knew what this was. This was the eviction meeting. He was done playing games. He was going to try to force me out legally, using the accumulation of fines and the complaints he had fabricated as justification. I dressed carefully. I wore a suit, not the casual clothes I usually wore to work from home. I wore a dark blue jacket, a crisp white shirt, and I polished my shoes. I wanted to look professional. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in a boardroom, not a tenant being called into the principal's office. I took a briefcase. Inside the briefcase, I placed a single folder. Inside the folder, I placed the documents proving my ownership of the mortgage note. I didn't take any other papers. I didn't take my lease. I didn't take the records of his harassment. I only needed the one thing that mattered. I left my apartment at 3:45 p.m. I walked down the stairs, my footsteps echoing on the concrete. The hallway was dark again, the bulb burnt out. I didn't mind. I knew the light was coming back. I knocked on the management office door at 4 p.m. exactly. I heard the shuffling of papers inside, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Gerald opened the door. He looked tired. There were bags under his eyes, and his hair was not as slick as usual, a few strands falling over his forehead. He smelled of coffee and stress. He stepped back to let me in, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. The office was cluttered, stacks of papers everywhere, unpaid bills mixed with eviction notices. The phone was ringing, but he ignored it. He sat down behind the desk and laced his fingers together, the gold ring clicking against his teeth. He didn't offer me a seat immediately, letting me stand for a moment, a power play to make me feel small. I remained standing, looking down at him. He frowned, then gestured again. I sat. I placed the briefcase on my lap, keeping it closed. He opened a file folder on his desk, pulling out a sheet of paper. He began to speak, his voice trying to regain that oily confidence, but it wavered slightly at the edges. He talked about the violations. He talked about the fines. He talked about the impact I was having on the community of the building. He said I was disruptive. He said I was difficult. He said that the ownership had decided that my tenancy was no longer viable. He was preparing to offer me cash for keys, a sum of money to leave voluntarily without a fight. He slid a check across the desk. It was for $5,000. It was an insult. He expected me to take it and run. I looked at the check. I didn't touch it. I looked up at Gerald. I asked him if he was sure about this. I asked him if he was sure he wanted to proceed with terminating my lease. He laughed, a nervous sound this time. He told me I didn't have a choice. He told me the paperwork was already prepared. He told me I had until Monday to vacate. I nodded slowly. I opened my briefcase. The sound of the latches clicking open was loud in the small room. Gerald stopped talking. He watched my hands. I took out the folder. I slid it across the desk, pushing the check back toward him with the edge of the folder. He looked at the folder. He looked at me. He asked me what this was. I told him it was the solution to his cash flow problems. I told him it was the answer to the foreclosure notice he had been hiding in the bottom drawer of that desk. He froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him gray and waxy. He reached for the folder, his hand trembling slightly. He opened it. He saw the letterhead of the bank. He saw the assignment of mortgage. He saw the name of my LLC. He saw the amount of the outstanding debt. He started reading, his eyes moving quickly across the page, then slowing down as the meaning hit him. He read it again. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I let the silence stretch. I let it fill the room, heavy and suffocating. I could hear the phone still ringing in the background, a persistent, annoying sound that matched the panic rising in his eyes. I told him that I was the new holder of the note. I told him that I was the one he owed money to. I told him that the bank was no longer his problem, I was. I explained, slowly and clearly, that according to the terms of the note, he was in default. I explained that I had the right to call the loan. I explained that I could foreclose on the building immediately. I watched him sweat. A bead of perspiration rolled down his temple, catching the light from the desk lamp. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He asked me what I wanted. He asked me how much. He thought I was there to extort him. He thought I wanted a payoff. I smiled. I told him I didn't want his money. I told him I wanted the building. I told him that effective immediately, I was exercising my rights as the lender. I was taking the property. I was terminating his management contract. I was evicting him. He stood up, knocking his chair over. He shouted at me. He called me a liar. He called me a tenant. He said I couldn't do this. He said he had lawyers. I told him to call them. I told him to call the bank. I told him to verify the transfer. I handed him my card. It had my name on it. It had the name of the LLC. It had my direct number. I told him he had 24 hours to vacate the management office. I told him that if he was still here tomorrow, I would call the sheriff. I told him that if he tried to harass any other tenant, I would sue him personally for every cent he had left. He slumped back into his chair. The fight went out of him. He looked old. He looked defeated. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man who realizes he has lost everything. He stared at the documents on his desk, the papers that sealed his fate. He reached for the check he had offered me, crumpling it in his fist. He threw it in the trash. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded. I stood up. I closed my briefcase. I walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the knob. I turned back to him. I told him that the hot water would be fixed by tomorrow. I told him that the heat would be turned up. I told him that the fines would be erased. I told him that the building was going to be repaired, properly, by people who were paid a living wage. I told him that he had failed this building. I told him that I wouldn't. I opened the door and walked out. I walked down the hallway, past the dark light bulb, past the stained carpet. I walked up the stairs to my apartment. I went into the bathroom. I turned on the shower. I waited. The pipes groaned, a deep, heavy sound, and then the water came. It was hot. It was steaming. I stood under the spray and let it wash over me, letting the heat soak into my skin, letting it melt the cold that had settled in my bones. I stayed there for a long time, until the water started to run cold again, not because it was broken, but because the tank was empty. I turned it off. I dried myself. I looked in the mirror. I looked tired, but I looked alive. The next day, Gerald was gone. The office was locked, but there were movers there, loading boxes into a van. They were his boxes. His personal effects. The building staff, the maintenance guys who had been too afraid to speak up, were standing in the lobby, watching. They looked relieved. Elena was there too. She smiled at me when I walked by. She asked me what happened. I told her the landlord changed. I told her things were going to be better. I didn't tell her it was me. Not yet. I wanted to let the changes speak for themselves. I hired a new property management company, a reputable one that actually cared about the tenants. I authorized the repairs. The boiler was fixed. The windows were sealed. The lights were replaced. The fines were wiped from everyone's ledger. I sent a letter to every tenant explaining the change in ownership of the debt and the new management structure. I kept my identity private for a while, operating through the LLC, but eventually, people figured it out. Elena found out. She thanked me. She said I saved them. I told her I'd just fixed a problem. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who had finally done what needed to be done. Gerald tried to fight it, of course. He sent lawyers. He sent letters. But the paperwork was solid. The debt was real. He had no ground to stand on. He lost the building.